So if there are questions that you have that we can help you with at this time, we're open to taking those now. So any thoughts in particular that you might have?
So we add up the portion of those rates for cultural, recreational,
can we get
social
that's
issues. Fine. It comes to a little over 25%. Now, a year ago, the government says council should be pulling back on that. Can we have an update, please?
Yeah, it's a very interesting argument, and having been in local government for 20 years, it's one that comes up every probably 5 or 6 years. A government will say, well, you should just be doing core business. And essentially that's the argument. What are you doing in a whole bunch of other things, community support, etc., etc.? And I think that's going to be an ongoing debate. What Christchurch is doing in this budget is probably no different to what the city has been doing for many years. It's part of the culture of the city. It's a city that has a very strong degree of support in a number of community and social services. Some of them don't have a ratepayer charge. For example, the social housing that we provide in the city, we've ensured that that is not funded by ratepayers. It's completely separate from ratepayer costs, so it's actually self-funding. Obviously there was an initial stake in 1931, but essentially from that time forward we've managed that within its own funding container, if you like, so that's not an impost. But a lot of those things are going to be libraries. It is true to say we do a huge amount of community grant support, so we'll be giving out effectively $10-12 million to a variety of community groups right across the spectrum in the city, from community sports clubs to groups for different social support and so forth and so on, city mission. And it is one of the things that's quite unique about Christchurch, and it is a question that does come up. Now, government's backed off because they started by saying it's going to be black and white. And then when they really started to think about it, it became really difficult to say what was core and what wasn't core. And I think the essence of local government, for me, is that communities should have the right to self-determine what we collectively think is core and not core. And we're answerable every 3 years at the polls. If the community don't think that the calls that we're making around some of those things are right, it'll become an election issue. So at the moment we're under no additional pressure to change the way we're doing our business from central government. Okay. Any other questions? So, as I said when I started out, I think one of the... Paul, did you want to add anything to that?
No.
I think, one of the things that I'm watching with interest is the argument that, clearly we've had a lot of pressure from central government from time to time around selling assets. And what we've really clearly said in this plan is that we don't want to sell assets. Now, that's not a reflection on government's own policies on the national level, but we're saying as a city and as the people who are entrusted with protecting the assets of the city, we actually think that it's better for our city at the end of this period to actually still be able to function as if there hadn't been an earthquake. So if we sell a number of those assets now, there is no doubt that we could get a short-term chunk of money and we would be taking on a lower level of debt. But on the other side of the argument, they're gone forever. And many of those are producing really, really well for us. So City Care is doing very, very well. Obviously, it's picked up a lot of contracts as a result of what's going on. And that's the old City Works Department. It's run as a commercial enterprise, separate from council. So it's isolated from council decisions and operates under the same commercial law as everybody else out there in the business community has to operate under. Orion's been a tremendous asset for the city. We own around 80% of Orion, and at different times it's given tens of millions. In fact, we'd be getting close to $1 billion, I would estimate, over the years from that particular organisation. Now, it is price controlled by central government, so that does limit the gains that you can get in the future. But again, my view is it's controlling a private, it's controlling a fundamental monopoly, really. And I think what people often forget is that Orion, because it's owned by the public, delivers its power at the same cost in Darfield or at Land's End on Banks Peninsula as it does in the central city. In other words, if you live further out, you don't have to pay more for that power to be delivered. We all share the cost. Now, I mean, I think that's a pretty extraordinary call that was made a long time ago, but it actually keeps life affordable for a lot of people around Christchurch and in the smaller communities, particularly a little bit further out. And I think that's one of the essential values of our province. That would arguably change if we were to sell that off, and we'd lose those great dividends. The airport, we've got there would be fewer airports in the world than there are fingers on my left hand that can operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And when you live in a counter time zone to most of the world's business and tourist producing countries, it's crucial for us and our economy to have a 24/7 airport. It's a huge asset for us, and we've protected that. Again, arguably, we've also been able to say to the airport company, it's not just about short-term profits. It's about ensuring that this very important piece of infrastructure is able to operate fully into the future. The port, well, we are trying to, at the moment, own the whole of the port. It's a publicly listed company. We've got approximately 80% of the shares in that. We would like to delist it. One of the reasons around that really is it would actually give us control. We don't have really any control over the port, although we have 80% of the shares and we can appoint directors. Once we've done that, it's under law its own entity, and essentially it has to produce a return for its shareholders, and it has an independent board. There are no councillors on that. And because it's listed on the stock exchange, they can't come down and knock on the door and say, look, we've got a problem, we'd like a bit of a hand with this, or we need something for that. You've got to actually do it completely equally to every single shareholder. We think that's a disadvantage. We think it's a strategic and vital natural monopoly for the city, and so the ownership of that should, in our view, currently be retained by the people. Again, it's a unique sort of thing. CityCare kind of sits outside of that. It is a contracting company, and I think there's a different argument, and it might be that some people want to bring that argument to council in terms of, well, should you stay in a contracting company? It's not a natural monopoly, and normally the margins aren't great in those sorts of businesses. But right now, they're tremendous, so it's actually bringing a lot of money back into the community. The other big thing is Enable. We're building the broadband fibre network throughout the city in Canterbury. We started Enable, 7 or 8 years ago, and really we only started Enable to frighten the telcos. And Paul used to work for one of those telcos, used to work for Telecom. We really just did it to frighten the telcos into doing the job themselves. We didn't want to build it, but they still wouldn't get off their butts and get into the city and give us a good broadband system, which we think is crucial for education and the economy of the city. So we started to build it. It actually has turned into a tremendous opportunity. We're now partnering with Crown Fibre Holdings to supply the broadband network for not just the city, but for the greater Christchurch area. We estimate that, all things being equal, that will be a company that will actually return a tremendous dividend flow for the citizens. And you haven't factored any of those potential dividends in yet, because we're only inside a 3-year plan. Right. We think around about 22, we should actually, if it meets its targets, see some tremendous inflows of dividends to us as a community. So, and because of the unique funding mechanism, they've been able to borrow their share of their costs, and the government, through Crown Fibre Holdings, is essentially funding that business into hopefully what will be a very successful business for the ratepayers of the city. But more than that, it's again a natural monopoly. We've got the airport, we've got the seaport, and now we're saying as citizens, we think we should try to control the data port and get those dividends back into our community as well. So that's a quick overview, and the argument is you should sell some of that off and have less debt. Our argument is we can sustain the debt level, and that keeps our options open for the future. So we don't end up having paid off all the earthquake and not having had as much debt. But at the end of that time, we're going to be very constrained in terms of what we can do as a community. We would have lost around about a 15 to 20% subsidy on the rates. So that means we're going to have to pay more money anyway. And we are able to take the dividends from our investments and use those for what we would call operating costs. Now, they are capital items, so if we sold them, we could only reinvest that into other capital items. So, for example, you could sell Orion and build 6 big swimming pools around Christchurch. But the cost of operating those pools would still have to be borne by the annual rates, and the cost of operating is currently subsidised to the tune of around $40 million a year by the dividends that we're getting from those companies. So we don't think that's actually in the best interests of the city to do. We think we should stick with what we've got. It's functioning well, carry some more debt. In terms of how it looks compared to anyone out there in the private sector, and actually to most of the other major councils in New Zealand, our debt level will still be much, much lower. And we measure that ratio of, we have a couple of measures which we publish so that we can compare how much we're spending on debt. And there are 2 ways that we do that. One is, what is the percentage of the overall budget that the cost of servicing that debt represents? And of a $1.4 billion budget this year, the cost of servicing that debt is going to be probably less than 1%, well down. If we do it, the other measure we use is the cash that we collect. Now, our budget this year is $1.4 billion, but rates are only about $300 million of that. The rest of it is going to be dividends, subsidies from central government, etc., etc. Some of it will be some land sales, selling land to the government in the frame, for example. We've got a lot of property in there. So the other measure is how much of the cash that you collect is servicing the debt, the cost of the interest. And our ratio for that is, what's the top ratio we've got on that?
250% that you're talking about?
No, I'm talking about the cash ratio, so real cash out of people's pockets. Yep. To the percent, to the amount of interest that we're paying.
Our limit is 30%, and we're at about 8%.
That's right. So we're well below that. So it's a very conservative local government set of values. Tony?
$70,000
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the sort of real-world comparison that we're using. At its peak, it's equivalent to servicing a $70,000 mortgage on a $350,000 house. So you've got a lot of safety margin in there. So that's once again why we're saying, look, let's not panic over this debt thing. You've always got the option of selling your assets down. That's always going to be there. But why should one generation essentially have to bear all of the operating costs? By borrowing it over, at this stage, 26 years, gives us a bit of headroom because we're still below the 30 maximum. So we can actually go a bit further if we need to. But it also spreads the cost in a much more reasonable way. We sell the assets, you lose the dividend flow, our rates today will go up. We'll be carrying all of the operating costs. When in fact many of the things that we're going to be building are going to have a capacity not for the city as it is today, but for the city as it will be in 50 years' time, based on all the projections we have.